They lied to you. The real Betty Boop story was black. Yeah, I said it. Because before America fell in love with that little white cartoon girl going boop-oop-a-doop, a black child star named Baby Esther was already on stage doing the baby voice, the funny faces, the dancing, and those little scat sounds that made the whole thing famous. And once you see who watched Esther perform before the boop exploded, this story gets real disrespectful. Her name was Esther Jones. She came out of Chicago in the 1920s, and this little girl could perform. She sang jazz, she danced the Charleston, she did acrobatics, she rolled her eyes, made exaggerated little faces, played up this cute baby persona, and threw nonsense sounds into her songs like boo-boo-boo, doo-doo-doo, and wa-da-da. That was part of her gimmick. Now pull up Betty Boop in your head. Big, expressive eyes, little exaggerated facial movements, tiny baby voice, jazz singing, dancing, random little boops inside the music. You see why people started asking questions? Baby Esther was doing her act years before Betty Boop became a cartoon star. And Esther wasn't some girl performing for 3 cousins in somebody's basement either. This child was becoming a legitimate attraction. She won attention as a Charleston dancer while she was still extremely young, and theatrical manager Lou Bolton began booking her around the country. By 1928, she was performing in New York at the Everglades, an after-hours club in Manhattan, billed as the miniature Florence Mills. Florence Mills was one of the great black entertainers of that era, so calling a little girl the miniature version of her was a serious compliment. Esther's whole act was built around being tiny, adorable, funny, talented, and musically unpredictable. She could go from dancing to making a face to tossing some ridiculous syllable into a song and have the room eating out of her hand. And here is what gets me. Betty Boop eventually became famous for almost that exact emotional recipe. Cute little face, adult jazz club energy, childlike voice, flirty movements, silly syllables, a character who could look innocent for 2 seconds and then turn around and own the whole room. Esther was already working that territory in real life. Then, in April 1928, according to testimony that would become very important later, another entertainer came into the Everglades and watched Baby Esther perform. Her name was Helen Kane. Remember that name? Because Helen Kane would soon become famous across America as the boop-oop-a-doop girl. Hold on, man. You got a black child in a New York club doing the baby voice in rhythmic nonsense syllables. A white singer reportedly watches the act. Then that white singer becomes nationally famous for a baby voice in rhythmic nonsense syllables. And a few years later, a cartoon based partly on that white singer becomes one of the most recognizable women in animation history. Baby, now we got a story. The documented trail does not give us some signed confession saying, I stole Esther's entire act. What it gives us is a timeline that gets more uncomfortable every time you add another piece. Esther performs first. Kane reportedly sees her. Kane's Boop persona blows up. Betty Boop follows. Then everybody gets rich and famous except the little black girl sitting at the beginning of the chain. And we haven't even gotten to the wild part yet, because while America would eventually forget Baby Esther, Europe treated this little girl like a superstar. She performed for royalty, appeared at the Moulin Rouge, and became so popular overseas that newspapers were writing about crowds coming specifically to see her. So before we even talk about who took what, you need to understand something. Baby Esther was already her. Baby Esther wasn't some forgotten amateur. This little black girl was performing for King's A&D Queens while she was still young enough to be playing with dolls. And once you see how big she actually became, the fact that Betty Boop is the name everybody remembers starts feeling crazy. Esther's talent carried her out of the United States and into Europe in 1929. Paris loved her. She performed at the Moulin Rouge, one of the most famous entertainment venues in the world. French audiences compared her to Josephine Baker and Florence Mills. She could sing, dance, do acrobatics, perform the Charleston, make those funny little faces, and work a crowd like somebody 3 times her age. One French magazine even put her on its cover. Newspapers described audiences flocking to see this tiny black American performer who had suddenly become one of the sensations of the European stage. Then the story gets even crazier. Esther performed before European royalty. Reports from the period describe appearances connected with the royal families of Spain, Sweden, Norway, and other elite audiences. Imagine that. A black girl from Chicago, growing up in America during segregation, crosses an ocean, and now kings and queens are showing up to watch her perform. Baby, I would have been unbearable. I'm walking around the palace like, yeah, tell His Majesty I go on at 8. And Esther adapted her act wherever she traveled. She learned songs in different languages. She performed for local audiences. She built this international persona around being funny, stylish, cute, energetic, and musically gifted. Now bring Betty Boop back onto the screen. Betty's appeal came from that same kind of immediate performance energy. She wasn't standing around giving speeches. Betty sang. Betty danced. Betty made faces. Betty played with her voice. Betty looked straight at the audience with those giant eyes and sold the entire performance through personality. Esther's act had those same broad ingredients years earlier. This is the comparison I care about because this is where you can actually see the cultural pipeline. Esther used a childish vocal tone. Betty became famous for a childish vocal tone. Esther used nonsense scat syllables. Betty became famous for nonsense syllables. Esther exaggerated her expressions and eye movements for comedy. Betty's entire animated face was built around exaggerated expressions. Esther danced inside a jazz and vaudeville world created heavily by black performers. Betty would become one of the biggest cartoon faces of jazz-age nightlife. The strongest historical link sits in that performance culture, and then one woman walks straight through the middle of it, Helen Kane. Kane was already an entertainer when she reportedly saw Esther at the Everglades in 1928. Then, Kane hits big with songs like I Wanna Be Loved by You and becomes famous for squeezing these little boop-oop-a-doop phrases into her singing. Her baby voice becomes her brand. Her round face, coy expressions, flapper styling, and boop gimmick make her instantly recognizable. America loves it. Suddenly, Helen Kane is the woman associated with the sound. And I need you to imagine how quickly popular culture worked even back then. Somebody hears something in a black nightclub, it moves on to a bigger stage. Then recordings spread it, movies spread it, newspapers spread it. By the time regular America hears it, they think the person standing in front of them created the whole thing. That pattern is old as dirt. And in Esther's case, we have testimony specifically placing Kane at one of her performances before Kane's boop identity became famous. Now here's the part that makes me want to grab somebody by the shoulders. Esther had already proven she could become a star. Europe had seen it. Royal audiences had seen it. American black newspapers were covering her travels. She had talent, a recognizable act, and a gimmick people remembered. Then the American mainstream gets a version of those ingredients through Helen Kane, and Kane becomes the boop-oop-a-doop girl. And then somebody at Fleischer Studios looks at Helen Kane and says, essentially, we need a cartoon version of that. Oh baby, here comes Betty. And this is where the black child's act turns into a white woman's brand, then that white woman's brand turns into Betty Boop. Follow the chain because it happens fast. Helen Kane's baby voice became a hit. Her boop-oop-a-doop phrase became so closely tied to her that audiences knew exactly who you meant when they heard it. She was cute. She was coy. She leaned into the little girl voice while performing grown woman jazz and pop songs. That combination made her stand out. Then in 1930, Fleischer Studios released a cartoon called Dizzy Dishes. And there she is, the earliest version of Betty Boop. At first, Betty wasn't even fully human. She was drawn as this bizarre little dog like Flapper with droopy ears, a tiny dress, giant eyes, and that familiar high-pitched singing style. I know, Betty Boop started as a dog. History is unserious sometimes. Then the character keeps appearing. The dog features slowly disappear. Those long ears become hoop earrings. Her face becomes human. The sharp black curls stay. The tiny dress stays. The giant eyes stay. The flirtatious jazz club personality gets stronger. By 1932, Betty is basically the woman everybody recognizes today. And Fleischer's people were very aware of Helen Kane. The character was based at least partly on Kane's popular persona. So now look at this family tree. Baby Esther, baby-style singing, nonsense scat syllables, dancing, funny facial expressions, jazz performance. Helen Kane, baby-style singing, boop-oop-a-doop, flapper image, coy facial expressions. Betty Boop, baby-style singing, boop sounds, flapper image, giant expressive eyes, jazz performances. Come on, bro, you don't need a detective board with red string to understand why people have been arguing about this for almost 100 years. And Betty takes off. This cartoon starts becoming more famous than the woman who inspired part of her persona. Betty gets her own starring cartoons. Betty sings, Betty dances, Betty gets chased by men. Betty becomes sexy, funny, rebellious, and instantly recognizable. Audiences love her. Meanwhile, Helen Kane's career starts cooling down. So now Helen Kane is sitting there watching a cartoon with her vocal gimmick become bigger than Helen Kane herself. You know she was hot. And I get it. You spend years becoming the boop girl, then somebody draws a cartoon, and now people are basically calling you the human Betty Boop. That would ruin my week. Then it turns into something deeper, because Kane sees money. Betty is being commercialized, Paramount is distributing the cartoons, Fleischer Studios has a hit. Everybody is getting something from this character. Kane feels like the entire thing came out of her public image. So she decides she wants her piece. And that decision becomes the worst possible thing she could have done if she wanted nobody asking where Helen Kane got her own gimmick. Because now lawyers are involved. Lawyers don't care about your cute little origin story. Lawyers start digging. And once they start digging, guess whose name crawls right back out of 1928? Baby Esther. But before we get there, look at what happened culturally. Esther's act was performed by a black child in nightclubs. Kane's version entered mainstream records and movies. Betty's version entered animation and became permanent. Each step gets bigger. Each step reaches more people. And Esther gets farther away from the spotlight. That is how somebody can influence the culture and still disappear from the popular memory of that culture. By the early 1930s, Betty Boop is becoming an icon while the little black performer linked to the roots of this controversy is literally traveling around the world. And then Helen Kane decides she's going to sue for $250,000 and prove Betty Boop stole from her. Baby, this woman accidentally ordered a full investigation into her own recipe. By the time Betty Boop blew up, Baby Esther had already lived a career most grown entertainers would kill for. A&E America still managed to forget her. That is the part of this story that actually bothers me. Because look at Betty Boop today. You've seen her on shirts, handbags, tattoos, posters, car decals, Halloween costumes. Somebody's auntie has a Betty Boop steering wheel cover right now. Do not argue with me. You know she does. Betty survived almost a century because the image became bigger than the cartoons themselves. Esther's image had the opposite fate. She toured. She performed. Newspapers covered her. European audiences celebrated her. Then the paper trail starts getting thin. And when that happens to a black entertainer from the 1920s, popular culture has a way of acting like they never existed. Esther returned to the United States after years of international travel, and by the mid-1930s, her public career fades from view. Details about her later life remain uncertain. Even modern internet posts have confused her with completely different women. Some of the viral Baby Esther photographs passed around online aren't Esther at all. Think about how wild that is. We remember Betty Boop's eyelashes better than we remember what the black child at the center of this history actually looked like. And when you do find surviving images and descriptions of the real Esther, the girl had personality. She's a tiny black child performer dressed for the stage, photographed and drawn as an entertainer, working the Charleston and jazz circuit while adults around her recognize she has something special. Contemporary accounts describe her funny dancing, expressive face, singing, and tremendous stage presence. Paris called her a sensation. She performed at the Moulin Rouge. European royalty watched her. That is the woman I want viewers seeing beside Betty Boop on the screen. Put Esther on the left. Put Helen Kane in the middle. Put Betty on the right. Then let the audience watch the cultural transformation happen with their own eyes. You start with a black child performing a playful jazz act. Then you get a white adult singer whose trademark becomes a similar baby scat gimmick. Then you get a cartoon flapper based partly on that white singer. The cartoon becomes the most famous of all three. That visual tells the story before I even finish the sentence. And the reason I keep coming back to Esther's success is because I don't want her reduced to the black girl connected to Betty Boop. Esther had her own story. This girl went places grown performers couldn't get booked. She crossed continents. She dealt with racism while traveling. In Sweden, reports described her being refused service at a restaurant because she was black, and the incident sparked public outrage. Imagine being celebrated by royalty, and then somebody at a restaurant looks at your skin and decides you don't deserve a table. That is the world she was navigating as a child entertainer. So when people ask why this story matters, that is why. Baby Esther wasn't waiting around for Betty Boop to make her historically interesting. She was already a talented black performer whose work sat inside the jazz age culture America was consuming. Her career deserves the movie by itself. Then history gives us this almost perfect twist where the entertainment industry accidentally brings her back into the spotlight years later. Because Helen Kane gets angry. Betty Boop has gotten too big. Kane decides enough is enough. She hires lawyers and demands $250,000. She wants a judge to officially recognize that Betty's famous persona came from her. And finally, after 4 chunks of following this little black girl through Chicago, New York, Paris, the Moulin Rouge, and European royal courts, we arrive at the courtroom. Because Helen Kane is about to stand up and claim ownership of the Boop, and somebody in that courtroom is about to say, actually, we need to talk about Esther. This woman sued Betty Boop for stealing her act, and the defense basically said, baby, who did you steal yours from? That is the courtroom part worth hearing. In 1932, Helen Kane filed a lawsuit against Fleischer Studios and Paramount seeking $250,000, an enormous amount of money at the time. Her argument was straightforward. Betty Boop copied Helen Kane. The look, the voice, the mannerisms, the famous boop-oop-a-doop style. And honestly, everybody knew Betty had been shaped partly around Kane's public persona. So Kane walks into this case thinking she has something. Then the defense starts attacking one specific word, original. They begin showing that baby-style singing, scat syllables, and similar vocal gimmicks had existed before Kane. Then theatrical manager Lou Bolton takes the stand. Bolton had managed Baby Esther. He tells the court he coached Esther to use playful interpolations like boo-boo-boo and wa-da-da-da in her songs. Then he testifies that Helen Kane had watched Baby Esther perform at the Everglades in New York back in 1928. Hold on. Imagine Kane's face. You came here to tell a judge this cartoon stole your thing, and now some man is telling the judge you were sitting ringside watching a black little girl do a similar thing before your own version became famous. That is nasty work. And then they bring in film connected to Esther's performance. The historical interpretation of that film has been debated by scholars. And Baby Esther was one piece of a larger defense showing earlier uses of baby singing and nonsense syllables. That broader evidence is what matters to the ruling. Other performers testified about similar sounds existing before Kane. The court eventually ruled against her. Justice Edward McGoldrick found that Kane had failed to prove that this baby-style technique originated with her. No $250,000. Betty Boop keeps going. Now this is the moment where the whole story comes together. Esther didn't have to sue Helen Kane. Esther didn't have to show up demanding credit. Helen Kane's own lawsuit forced the entertainment industry to trace the sound backward. And when they went backward, Baby Esther was sitting there. Baby, that is poetic. Kane says, they copied me. The defense says, let's discuss who came before you. And suddenly, the forgotten black child performer is relevant enough to help destroy one of the biggest entertainment claims of the era. Yet after the case ends, Betty Boop goes right back to becoming Betty Boop. The merchandise grows, the cartoons survive, the image becomes iconic. Helen Kane remains part of Betty's official history because the character was modeled partly on her. Esther slips away again. That is why I keep saying the real Betty Boop story was black. The evidence connects Baby Esther to the performance history beneath the famous boop style. The lawsuit is where that connection enters the permanent record. And the funniest part is, Helen Kane helped preserve it by suing. Girls, sometimes you need to leave well enough alone. You start asking people to investigate where something came from, and they might actually investigate. Then you're sitting there wishing everybody would stop investigating. And after almost a century, that lawsuit is one of the main reasons we can still point back and say, wait, who was that black child? That question brought Esther Jones back into the conversation. And once you learn what she had already accomplished before the trial, the story stops being trivia about a cartoon. It becomes a story about how culture moves, how credit moves, and how the person at the beginning can become the easiest person to erase. So here's the part that should make you mad. Betty Boop became immortal. Baby Esther became a Google search. One is still on merchandise almost 100 years later. The other was a real black child who sang, danced, did acrobatics, performed across America, conquered European stages, entertained royalty, and became part of the evidence that helped defeat Helen Kane's claim that the famous baby singing style belonged to her. And I think that is why people keep coming back to this story even when the internet gets some of the details wrong. There is something emotionally true sitting underneath the controversy. Black entertainers helped create the sound and movement of American popular culture, and the biggest commercial images attached to those styles were often somebody else. Baby Esther's story fits that pattern almost too perfectly. Start with Esther, a black child with a baby voice, scat syllables, funny expressions, jazz, dancing. Then Helen Kane reportedly watches her perform. Kane becomes famous for her own boop persona. Fleischer Studios builds Betty partly around Kane. Betty becomes bigger than Kane. Kane sues. Lawyers trace the performance style backward. Esther's name comes back. Kane loses. Then Esther disappears from mainstream memory while Betty's face gets plastered on everything from purses to tattoos. Man, come on. If I wrote that as fiction, somebody would tell me I was being too obvious. And I want to be very precise about the legacy, because Esther deserves accuracy. The documented record supports her as an important predecessor in the performance history exposed during the Betty Boop lawsuit. Helen Kane was a direct inspiration for Betty Boop's character. The alleged Kane to Esther borrowing comes from testimony and remains debated in parts of the scholarship. That complicated trail actually makes the story more interesting because we can watch a cultural style move through multiple performers until the biggest commercial version becomes a cartoon. And every time the style moves, the audience gets bigger. Esther performs in clubs. Kane records songs and makes movies. Betty gets animation, distribution, merchandise, and decades of nostalgia. That is how memory gets built. People remember what gets repeated. Betty was repeated everywhere. Esther wasn't, so I want you to remember the name Esther Jones. Baby Esther, Little Esther, the miniature Florence Mills. A black child entertainer who could work a stage well enough to become a sensation overseas while still young enough to be called baby. She deserves to exist in history outside of somebody else's cartoon. And next time somebody shows you one of those viral posts saying Betty Boop was black, now you actually know the story underneath the headline. You know there was a real black performer. You know what her act looked and sounded like. You know who reportedly watched her. You know how Helen Kane became famous. You know how Betty Boop emerged from Kane's persona. And you know what happened when Kane tried to claim the boop in court. They followed the sound backward and found a black little girl standing there. That is the line I want you leaving this video with. Because history can hide the person, lose the photographs, forget the career, and put somebody else's face on the merchandise. The receipts have a nasty habit of surviving. So tell me this in the comments. When you put Baby Esther, Helen Kane, and Betty Boop side by side, who do you think deserves more credit? And if this is the first time you've ever heard the name Baby Esther, comment Esther, because this little girl should have never been this easy to forget.